Abnormal psychology, the study of mental illness or psychopathology, has only recently entered mainstream scientific thought. People who are suffering from some sort of mental illness may be shunned by society. This may be because the causes of psychopathology and the problems mentally ill individuals face are not well understood. Misunderstanding the mentally ill has a long and troubling past. Historically, abnormal behavior was explained by invoking demon possession, evil spirits, being in league with the devil, witchcraft, and so on. The supernatural causes understanding of abnormal behavior resulted in so-called treatments that often involved brutal methods of removing the demons. Such methods included drownings, burnings, bleedings, and so forth. We can see a connection between modern and archaic views of abnormal behavior by looking at two books, the Malleus Maleficarum, written in 1486, and the DSM-5, published in 2013. Heinrich Kramer apparently intended the Malleus, which translates to the Hammer of Witches, to be used to find and persecute witches. Although most of the Malleus is an argument for the existence of witchcraft and the prosecution of suspected witches, a small part of this book is about identifying witches. The DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, is used to help diagnose mental illness. So, from a theoretical perspective, the two books serve different purposes. But given that older views of mental illness were explained by demonology, we can speculate that the Malleus was in some ways serving the same purpose as the DSM. In the United States, the most famous example of abnormal behavior being attributed or blamed on demons or witchcraft was probably the Salem witch trials. Over 15 months between 1692 and 1693, these trials led to the execution of 20 people, mostly women who were hanged. Apparently, many of the accused exhibited behaviors that residents attributed to witchcraft. One man was even pressed to death. This was probably an extremely painful way to die. There have been several hypotheses proposed to explain the events, including the idea that demons and witchcraft are real, fraud or attention-seeking by the accused girls, hysteria, encephalitis, Freudian projection, post-traumatic stress disorder, and Lyme disease. Dr. Linda Caparol, however, suggested an alternative explanation, that the girls were suffering from ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that infects rye grain. When people eat rye bread made from infested grain, they can experience convulsive ergotism. Symptoms of toxicity can include seizures, mania, what appear to be psychotic episodes, itching, and so forth. But ergot is also a natural source of LSD. LSD derived from ergot is apparently weaker than the form synthesized in the laboratory. When people eat infested bread, they may experience symptoms similar to LSD intoxication. These include fits and hallucinations, spasms, screaming, throwing things, and nausea. The connections between several factors led Dr. Caparol to suggest that the accused girls might have suffered from ergot poisoning. She points to 3 lines of evidence in support: the growing conditions around Salem at the time, localization or where the accused girls were, and testimony from the trials. Let's consider the growing conditions first. Wild rye is a host plant for ergot, but the early colonists didn't like it because it made the cattle ill with unknown diseases. So it can be assumed that the Puritans found wild rye already growing when they arrived in the New World. Because rye was a dependable grain, by about 1640 it was widely used. It was usually planted in the spring and reaped in August. The settlers probably waited until the weather turned cold before threshing the grain, and this would likely have been right before Thanksgiving. The children started having symptoms in December 1691, but by the next year, the witchcraft crisis suddenly ended. Now, rye ergot fungus infestation is more likely when spring weather is warm and rainy. Some of the records suggest that spring 1691 had early rains, but that there was a drought in 1692. This could explain why the witchcraft crisis appeared and disappeared abruptly in Salem. Now let's look at where the girls were when they were accused. Ergot grows in low, wet ground. One of the accused girls and her mother lived on a large holding owned by Thomas Putnam. This was in a swampy part of western Salem. This kind of land was valued for farming, so it seems likely that a large part of the village received grain from Putnam. Several of the girls also lived in western Salem. Now, not all of the accused girls displayed symptoms or were accused at the same time, but the timing and geographical pattern of afflictions seems consistent with when villagers might have gotten grain from Putnam. Finally, think about the testimony at the major trial. A cake made from rye mixed with the urine of the girls had been fed to a dog. It was thought that the witch cake would identify witches by causing them injury. Although no apparent harm came to the suspected girls, the affected ones later accused 3 other girls of being witches. During the trial, the affected girls sometimes described activities of invisible spirits and frequently went into fits. These were blamed on torture, but could be from ergot poisoning. One of the witnesses said that something came through the window that had the body of a monkey, claws, and feet like a rooster. Another witness suggested that a cow had taken the place of a woman. Although there is much more to the story than I've described, the growing conditions, localization, and testimony seem consistent with ergot poisoning. If we now move a couple of centuries after the Salem trials, we see the beginnings of more modern and humane perspectives. But even in the late 19th century, the mentally ill were still treated differently. Bedlam, a word meaning chaotic or mad, apparently had its origins with Bethlem Royal Hospital in London. People considered mad or insane were locked up and chained. At times, the hospital was even open to the public, who could see the mad inmates. Later reformers like Philippe Pinel and Dorothea Dix insisted that madness be treated humanely. One major idea was to reduce the stress that mentally ill individuals experienced, in some cases providing a calming atmosphere for them. Hence the term asylum, or political protection for people who have left their original country, was soon co-opted to insane asylum. With more progress, mental illness replaced madness. And that's where we are today. Psychology knows more about the causes and effective treatments for psychopathology, but for many, the stigma of being mentally ill remains.